Welcome to today's program in our Finger Lakes History Series. I am Seneca County historian Walt Gable. Because Halloween is rapidly approaching, I thought to help get us all in the mood, I would focus this program on some haunted tales, hoaxes, and some strange but true stories here in the Finger Lakes. There are several places in the Finger Lakes that have ghost stories associated with them. One of those places is the Seneca Falls Historical Society, which actually has 3 ghost stories associated with it. The first deals with the ghost of Edward Minders, who built the original house in 1855. If you look at the 2 pictures of the house, the bottom picture shows the house as it looked when Edward Minders built it in 1855. The top picture shows how the house was enlarged and remodeled in a new architectural style in the 1880s, and then occupied by a few generations of the Becker family. In this first ghost story, while the Becker family were occupants of the house, there were several instances of pictures being turned around to face the wall, and the clocks stopped running. Did the ghost of Edward Minders not like the changes that had been made to the home? The Seneca Falls Historical Society has owned the house since 1962, and there have been some other happenings with Edward's ghost. There have been problems with bats, and trying to catch a bat proved very difficult. But one time, the ghost apparently of Edward Minders helped to catch the ghost by rattling the china and the silverware on the buffet in the dining room, and to help people be led to where the bat was actually hiding. Also, one morning, Fran Barberi, who's worked at the Historical Society for several years, couldn't get the back door open when she came to work in the morning. The main door, that's the main door that people used coming into the Historical Society. The reason she couldn't get the door open was that it was latched from the inside. Fran had to break a window to get access into the mansion. Since then, she's been very careful, as the last person to leave the mansion at the end of the workday, to say, "Good night, Edward," and there hasn't been a problem of the door being latched since then. Another ghost story associated with the Seneca Falls Historical Society is that of Mary Merrigan, who served for many years as the nanny for the Becker family children. She had her bedroom on the 3rd floor. After several years of faithful service, her dementia became bad enough that in 1957 she was put in the hospital. The night she died, her ghost appeared to the Becker children. Was it an attempt to bid the children farewell? One night in August 2001, Eric Lewis was called to the house by his sister Patricia, who had been working alone that night in the mansion and heard someone walking upstairs. Eric came to Pat's rescue, but brought with him a tape recorder and placed it in the bedroom that Mary Merrigan had been using. When he later listened to the tape recording, he heard a voice saying, "Excuse me, you hit me." Apparently, he had bumped into Mary's ghost when he was setting up the tape recorder. A third ghost story deals with the sounds of a young girl crying. A 15-year-old Irish girl had been living in the house, and she died of consumption. She was heard crying on the back staircase, the staircase that the servants would have used. In fall 2002, a camera crew and a psychic spent the night in this house. The psychic said early on, "There is someone very sad in the house. She wants to go home to Ireland, and she needs to be released." So those present held a seance to release the young girl, and her crying voice has not been heard since then. Now, in the book Ghosts and Hauntings of the Finger Lakes, there are lots of ghost stories, and some deal with Aurora, New York, which is located on the east side of Cayuga Lake. In 1919, there was a disastrous fire that destroyed much of the downtown portion of the village. In that disastrous fire, 2 men and 1 woman perished. Since that fire, different people have reported they have seen the apparitions of the men pacing along the lake near the village park. There have also been reportings of a female ghost who has come to be known as the Lady in White. She makes her presence known to staff and guests inside the Aurora Inn as she passes through the lobby and some of the guest rooms. To talk about other ghost stories in Aurora, New York, we need first of all to look at this map. You'll notice in the blue arrows I've pointed out the location of the main building, as it's called today, of Wells College, and also the location of the Pettibone House. There are ghost stories associated with these. Just to the right of the Pettibone House, although it's not shown on the map, is a bridge that led to another building known as Glen Park. Our first ghost story deals with a woman who suspected her husband of having an affair at the Pettibone House. The man's wife confronted the woman on the bridge between Glen Park and the Pettibone House, and the woman stabbed and killed with a knife. For many years thereafter, a light on the bridge seemed to go on and off, and there were reports of a ghost, apparently the ghost of the jealous wife, pulling a knife from her coat. There's another ghost story that's associated with this same Pettibone House. About 1900, 2 senior co-eds at Wells College, their names Anne and Mary, were unpacking their suitcases upon return from their spring break. Their close senior friend Edith didn't seem to be acting her normal self as they saw her. Edith appeared to be worried about what would happen to their friendships once they all graduated soon from that college. Edith told Anne and Mary that she was going to see another friend, Carol, and she would be back soon. But Edith didn't return, and she didn't return. Soon Anne and Mary were called into the college dean's office. The dean told Anne and Mary that Edith had been killed in a car accident on her way back to college from spring break. Was it just a ghost that had appeared to Anne and Mary to say, "I'm going to see Carol and I'll be back soon"? Another ghost story that's associated with Wells College deals with the aftermath of the influenza epidemic of 1918-19. In that flu epidemic, Wells College co-eds who became ill were put in a room on the 4th floor of that main building you saw on the map. Bodies of those who died, and many people who contracted that influenza in that epidemic, died very quickly, within a day's time. The ones who died, who were college co-eds, were put into a special room on that 4th floor, and the door of that room was painted red. After the flu epidemic passed, that 4th floor returned to being a regular dormitory for college co-eds. The red door of that one special room was painted over, but no matter how many layers of paint was applied, the red color always bled through on that door. Also, Several students living on that fourth floor reported that they were awakened in the night to see the apparition of a nurse placing an icy hand on their forehead and then suddenly disappearing before their eyes. Hopefully you all recognize this house as the William Seward Mansion in Auburn and the picture of Harriet Tubman there. The ghost story that's associated with this is that there was the apparition of a short black woman covering her face, and the apparition has been seen walking toward the house with a girl about 14. Now, we know historically there's documentation that William and his wife operated a station on the Underground Railroad in the basement kitchen of this house. And so it would not be unusual to have Harriet Tubman bringing a runaway slave there, perhaps, or it just simply being two runaway slaves approaching the Seward home. Now, today we call those runaway slaves freedom seekers rather than fugitive slaves. And are there ghosts of those runaway slaves at this mansion? Shifting our location to Ithaca, we have ghost stories that are associated with the State Theater and the so-called curse of the Columbia Inn. When the State Theater was being constructed in 1916, a complete skeleton and 2 human skulls were found in the excavations. Now, the State Theater was being built on the foundation of the Columbia Inn, where in 1831, Guy Clark had axed his wife Fanny to death. Guy Clark was hung and buried on site, but the body disappeared. Because the Columbia Inn lost so many customers, William Brundage tore the Columbia Inn down. And as was typical of the time, some of the lumber was then used to build the Carson's Tavern across the street. On July 18, 1841, at Carson's Tavern, a drunkard by the name of John Graham murdered John Jones. Graham was hanged for the murder, and many people believe that it was the lumber from the Columbia Inn that cursed the tavern with pure evil. Not surprisingly, no one seemed upset when Carson's Tavern went up in flames in an 1845 fire that destroyed much of a city block. The ghost story gets even more complicated as I tell you about Edward Ruloff. Here you see a picture of Edward Ruloff. He's what you would clearly call a serial murderer. He had come to Ithaca in 1845 after having served 2 years in a jail in Ontario, Canada. In June of 1845, he confessed to giving his wife Harriet a lethal dose of chloroform and slitting her throat and smothering their child and stuffing both bodies in a trunk and dumping the trunk into Cayuga Lake. So Ruloff spent time in Auburn prison for abduction. Later, he was accused of more murders and spent time in Sing Sing prison. In 1871, he was convicted and executed for the murder of 2 clerks in Binghamton. But there's more to the story. When Ruloff was convicted of those 2 murders in Binghamton, there was some concern that he should not actually receive the death penalty. This was because he was a noted philologist. Many people believed that his life should be spared so that he could continue to contribute to that field of study, writing still more books in the field of philology. The famous historian Mark Twain the famous humorist Mark Twain sarcastically wrote that another person should be hanged in place of Roelof. Now, Roelof was hanged, however, and his hanging happens to be the last public hanging that ever took place in New York State. Allegedly, he said at the hanging, "Hurry it up. I want to be in hell in time for dinner." His brain was saved, and it's currently on display in the Wilder Brain Collection in room 211 of Uris Hall on the Cornell University campus. His brain, as of 1970, was the second largest brain in size ever to be measured. I hope you all know whose brain is the largest ever to have been measured. Going on, now I love to tell my tale of a whale or a whale of a tale. On June 5th, 1888, a 65-foot-long sperm whale was captured off Cape Cod. A 22-foot section of that captured whale was basically embalmed and then taken on a 2-year-long traveling exhibition. This 22-foot section of that sperm whale was large enough that 25 adults could be seated at a table in that section. That section of the whale was probably propped open with wooden studs to help keep the roundish shape. Now, in that 2 years of exhibition, thousands of people paid to see the so-called his whale ship when it was on exhibition at the New York State Fair in Syracuse and places prior to that. From the Syracuse Fair, the whale proceeded west on the Erie Canal, and it was on exhibit in Seneca Falls on November 10th and 11th of that year. Here you see actually a poster of the whale being on exhibition here in Seneca Falls. Now, from Seneca Falls, his whale ship continued on to Waterloo, where it was on exhibit at the Eagle Tavern. While it was on exhibit in Waterloo the first day, a group of rowdies threatened to put the whale section into the canal to see if it could swim. The whale and its display wagon were locked up in the barn of the Eagle Tavern for the night. About 3 a.m. the next morning, people were awakened to see the whale on fire out in the street. You can imagine how easily that whale must have burned, having been embalmed with those fluids that were highly flammable and that wooden support structure to it. The one who set his whale ship, or the several few who set his whale ship on fire, were never apprehended and punished. John Becker, in his A History of the Village of Waterloo in 1949, wrote this about the incident. The burning of the whale did more for Waterloo than was intended. The perpetrators contemplated only a little amusement in rebuking a gross imposition, but had the village been the theater of such a battle and victory as that which has given it its name, after all, Waterloo is named after the Battle of Waterloo in Europe, she would have been scarcely more signalized. On the eastern sea and beyond, the father of the western rivers, in other words, the Mississippi River, and in distant southern climes, this unpretending town became known as the place where the whale burned. But there's more to this story. In February 2012, Syracuse Post-Standard columnist Dick Case wrote about the whale being on exhibit at the Syracuse Fair and included in his column a picture of the poster for the whale on exhibit in Seneca Falls. But he didn't know what happened to the whale after it was on exhibit in Seneca Falls. So I read the article. I emailed him the rest of the story. In other words, it's being burned in Waterloo. And Case included that additional information in his April 5th column. But there's another whale connection to the Finger Lakes. In November of 1820, there was a real incident of a sperm whale capsizing a whaleboat called the Essex in the Pacific Ocean. Soon after the sinking of the Essex, there were accounts of the incident appearing in book form, making use of the memories of the ship's captain. We also know that Herman Melville was well aware of the Essex story prior to writing his famous novel, Moby Dick. However, about 2000, another account of the Essex appeared in a new book titled In the Heart of the Sea, which was based on the notebook of the Essex young shipboy Thomas Nickerson. That manuscript of his account had been lost for several decades. A movie version of In the Heart of the Sea can be seen on cable television regularly now. There is a Finger Lakes connection in that the Thomas Nickerson notebook somehow ended up in a home in Penn Yan and was misplaced for several decades. It was only after this misplaced notebook was found that writer Nathaniel Philbrick seized upon the opportunity to transform the notebook into his best-selling book, In the Heart of the Sea. As long as we're talking about the sea and water, we should go on to the story of the sea serpent of Seneca Lake. Now, I wrote about this article just several years ago, and periodically I have people that are contacting me wanting to know if they can get permission to use this story. The story has truth to it. Allegedly, one summer night, a group were enjoying an evening cruise on the Oticiana ship on Seneca Lake. They had set out from Geneva. Roughly midway down Seneca Lake, someone on board spotted far in front of the boat what looked like an overturned boat. As the Oticiana made its initial approach to reach the object disappeared below the surface of the lake. Moments later, the object emerged from the water, and people on board felt they saw the object's head with 2 rows of sharp white teeth. The object was perceived to be some kind of a sea monster, and at one point it was only about 50 yards ahead of the boat. The boat made several passes to try to snare the sea monster. After several passes of the boat, the side wheel of the boat struck the creature, giving it a fatal blow to the back. They were attempting to tow the carcass back to Geneva, but the towing was unsuccessful, as there were fears that the ropes tied to the carcass would drag the boat under the surface of Seneca Lake as the carcass sunk. Now, we need to understand some of the people that were on board the boat. One was a geologist, and he described the whole incident as follows. The serpent was about 25 feet long, with a long tail that tapered until about 5 feet at the end, then broadened out and looked much like a whale. The creature weighed about 1,000 pounds. Its head perhaps was 4 feet long and triangular in shape. Its mouth was very long and was armed with 2 rows of triangular white teeth as sharp as a shark's, but in shape more like those of a sperm whale. Its body was covered in horny substance, which was as much like a terrapin or tortoise as anything I know. The horny substance was brown in color and of greenish tinge. The belly of the creature, which I saw as the rope slipped and the creature was going down, was cream white. The eyes were round, much like a fish. It did not blink. Now, in social studies, I would say you've got to consider how reliable is this eyewitness account. Is this a reasonable person to believe? He is a geologist. Don't you have to believe a geologist? Now, at that time, of course, there were more than one newspaper in Geneva, and the rival newspapers in Geneva at the time reported on the incident. There were allegations that the passengers were overcome by the heat. It was a hot July night, or that they'd had too much to drink that night. As I had indicated earlier, there is a recent DVD titled Exploring Seneca that tries to give explanations such as a monstrous water creature could indeed have made it from the Atlantic Ocean, up the Hudson River, up the Erie Canal, into the Cayuga-Seneca Canal, and into Seneca Lake. Now, while we're on Seneca Lake, we need to deal with these reports that there are these mysterious booming sounds on the lake. There's also been reports of similar kinds of boomings on Cayuga Lake, but they're more frequently made about Seneca Lake. The Seneca Indians interpreted those booming sounds on Seneca Lake as the sound of the drums of their forefathers. There are local residents who have claimed that these booming sounds are loudest just before some natural disaster, such as the severe flooding that happened in Watkins Glen and much of the Finger Lakes region in July of 1935. Probably a scientific explanation for these booming sounds is that natural gas is being released from the fissures or cracks in the rocks at the bottom of the lake. Another possibility, it is the result of an evening temperature inversion setting up over the lake. Now, I'm not enough of a scientist to explain all of this to you. If you contact me, however, I will supply you with that particular scientist's article in terms of this evening temperature inversion. One more story associated with Seneca Lake are the painted rocks. Just north of Watkins Glen on the east side of Seneca Lake, you will see a cliff section that has these painted images. According to Indian legend, these images in the lower right picture were painted by Seneca Indians who had escaped from General Sullivan's troops by the Indians going over the cliff. The upper left picture shows a portion of the paintings done in 1929 for the Sullivan Sesquicentennial. If you look closely at these images, you will note two historical factual errors in the images. One error is that there are teepees, but we know the Senecas lived in longhouses. A second error is the American flag. Why would Seneca Indians paint an American flag? And second, the American flag appears to be flying in the wrong direction. Now, going over to the Taghanic Falls area, we have the story of the Taghanic Giant, probably one of the biggest hoaxes in the whole history of our Finger Lakes. The Taghanic Giant was a 7-foot petrified stone man and became a popular tourist attraction. It was on the 4th of July in 1879 that a giant stone man was unearthed near Taghanic Falls when workmen were widening the carriage drive to the Upper Glen. This petrified stone giant man weighed 800 pounds and was 7 feet in length, and it was found on the property of John Thompson. Scientists came in from Cornell University and other places. They examined this found object and proclaimed it to be an authentic, petrified human being. Lots of money was made from the sale of photographs of the Cardiff Giant, as it became known. One night, however, Frank Kreck had too much to drink at a local bar, and he revealed that the Cardiff Giant was nothing but a hoax. The facts about the hoax are as follows. Property owner Thompson got Ira Dean to mix up a thick batter composed of eggs, beef blood, iron filings, and a special plaster of cement, and molded this mixture into the shape of a prehistoric man. This was then baked in a huge oven in the dead of night. The object was taken by Thompson, Dean, and Kreck and pushed into a place in the ground by shoving it laterally through a tunnel. Despite these revelations that Kreck had made, it was still difficult to convince people that the Cardiff Giant was a hoax. So what happened? Dean had to create another miniature stone man of that same mixture to convince even some scientists that it was all a hoax. As the Cardiff Giant was being removed, however, it was dropped and broken. According to the story, the fragments were buried in an orchard near Trumansburg, but the exact location of where it was buried was forgotten. And just a few years before this hoax of the Cardiff Giant, in 1869, there was the Cardiff Giant that was discovered. The Cardiff Giant was also a hoax. It was a larger prehistoric stone man, supposedly, and it can still be seen on public display at the Farmers Museum in Cooperstown. Now, we have a song, Defying Gravity, from the musical Wicked, but we can defy gravity on Spook Hill near Canandaigua Lake. There's an interesting optical phenomenon at Spook Hill on Newell Road in Middlesex. Legend has it that if you put your car in neutral at a certain spot on the road, Indian spirits whose bodies are buried nearby will push your car back up the hill. If you look in your rearview mirror as you are going down the hill, it looks as if you are being dragged up the hill. Now, I caution you, if you go out to do this, be careful to watch for cars coming. Now I'm going to tell about the Fox sisters near Newark. Just a short distance north and west of the village of Newark is a tiny hamlet known as Hydesville. It was named after a Dr. Hyde. It was there in Hydesville that the John D. Fox family was living in a cottage that had been previously occupied by a Michael Weekman, who suddenly fled for mysterious reasons. A peddler named Charles B. Rosna was believed to have been murdered there in the cottage. In 1843, bones were found in the cottage's cellar, and many began to wonder, is it the ghost of Rosna haunting the cottage? Starting in mid-March 1848, some members of the Fox family said they began to hear mysterious rappings coming from the walls of their new home. More specifically, on the night of March 31st, 1848, it was reported that Margaret and Kate Fox were awakened at night by cold hands that brushed across their faces. Kate Fox seemed entertained by her apparently supernatural visitor that she named Mr. Splitfoot. She discovered that he would reply to her finger snappings and in a similar manner would answer her questions with rappings for yes or not rapping for no as an answer to a question. Now, on April 4th, 1848, the mother of these two Fox girls signed an affidavit about what had happened, and I'll read a portion of it. My youngest child, Kathy, that's what would be Kate, said, Mr. Splitfoot, do as I do, clapping her hands. The sound instantly followed her with the same number of raps. When she stopped, the sound ceased for a short time. Then Margaretta said in sport, now do just as I do. Count 1, 2, 3, 4, striking one hand against the other at the same time. And the raps came as before. She was afraid to repeat them. Then Kathy said in her childish simplicity, oh, Mother, I know what it is. Tomorrow's April Fool's Day, and it's somebody trying to fool us. This slide shows more of the mother's affidavit, but I won't take the time to read it aloud. The point is that out of these rapping sounds arose a religious movement that became known as spiritualism. Spiritualism is a belief that living human beings can communicate with the spirits of the dead, and that these spirits were capable of providing useful knowledge to living humans. This movement arose during the latter years of the so-called Great Awakening in the burned-over district of western New York, at a time when many people died at an early age and often very suddenly. They would die before loved ones had an opportunity to say their goodbye. What I'm trying to suggest is that at that time, there was certainly a desire to be able to communicate with the dead, if nothing else than to say goodbye. The Fox sisters became very famous mediums for seances dealing with this spiritualism. In this slide, you see Dr. Flint examining the Fox sisters in 1851. Apparently, Dr. Flint felt that what the Fox sisters were doing in their seances was legitimate. In the midst of their fame as real mediums who could help communicate with the dead, Margaret Fox, one night in 1888, said that everything they had done was a hoax, that the mysterious rapping sounds were made not by dead creatures, but simply by one of the Fox sisters cracking their toes. The reactions to this revelation of Margaret Fox were mixed. Some critics said, I told you so, while supporters of spiritualism denounced Margaret as simply the comments made by a drunk. Margaret, in 1891, recanted her confession, said it really wasn't a hoax. But the loss of fame of the Fox sisters destroyed them both. Kate drank herself to death in 1892. Margaret died penniless in 1893. Now, in this slide, you see a picture of the cottage in Hydesville where the Fox family lived. In 1915, the cottage was moved to the spiritualism headquarters called Lilydale in western New York. One night, the cottage mysteriously burned. But at Hydesville, we have this memorial park. And this is the brochure. I've scanned that. Now, over the foundation of the Hydesville cottage was built this structure. You'll notice that there are many windows so that you could look inside. And as I looked inside, I took these pictures of what you can see of the cottage foundation. Going on, there's ghost stories associated with Belle, Hearst, castle. And when I was there with a family gathering yesterday, I happened to mention to the waitress I'm going to be telling stories about Belhurst Castle. Now, Belhurst Castle was built on the site of the Hermitage, whose first resident was a man named Henry Buck. He died of blood poisoning in 1836. In the process of tearing down that Hermitage and building the new Belhurst Castle, one man died by falling off the tower. Another man went insane while roofing, and that's a very steep roof. For many years, Belhurst flourished as a Prohibition-era casino, and for many years it became a famous restaurant. Many hotel rooms have been added as a wing to the original Belhurst Castle, and there are still guest rooms upstairs in the original castle building. And there have been reports of, quote, faint sounds of a baby crying and a woman singing lullabies in the billiard room, as well as other rooms throughout the castle. There have been reports of the apparition of a man in the men's room. Who could that ghost be? Could it be the original person of the Hermitage Mansion? There is also the story of the White Lady. An opera singer fled Spain with her lover. Her husband tracked them to Belhurst Castle. As the lovers were fleeing in the tunnels connecting the wine cellar of Belhurst Castle to the carriage house, the tunnel suddenly collapsed on them. The apparition of this woman in white has been spotted drifting along the shore of the lake. A similar apparition has been seen on the private balcony of the billiard room, which is one of 14 guest rooms in the castle itself. There are many ghost stories associated with the Erie Canal, which of course was derisively nicknamed Clinton's Folly, a foolish waste of money on the part of Governor Clinton. In a small cemetery north of Montezuma are buried 26 workers who died of smallpox while doing reconstruction work on the Erie Canal. Over the years, the practice evolved of youth visiting these graves on a full moonlit October night. And one source quotes this: "It is said the workers appear as phantom forms above their graves and moan and groan as if still in the grips of the smallpox fever. Some of the youngsters have claimed that if you stand still, either because of intrigue or fright, you can hear two words repeating in the wind: Clinton's Folly, Clinton's Folly." Continuing on, it is said, quote, "Then the phantom form appears wearing black, weaving back and forth, as if propelled by invisible hot air currents. The specters bemoaning their fate take form from the waist up, but from the waist down, a fading trail goes down into the grave. That grave appears to be anchoring them to the spot. For those who go running and screaming into the night, it is said the ghosts stretch out their anchors, thinning into pencil-sized strings as they block the escape. With a phantom finger pointed in your face, the spooks chase you around the cemetery until at last you rush past them to safety. If you have managed to stand your ground, it is said that the ghosts all come together in a blinding light as the trails now glowing brightly return to the graves." I finish my quote. Well, I've shared with you some ghost stories, and in this next frame you're going to see some books that you can use to learn about these ghost stories and many other ghost stories. And in the next frame, I can share with you still 2 more books. I will leave it for you to determine which are haunted ghost stories, which are hoaxes and which are strange but true stories. And I wish you happy Halloween.